Hello and welcome back. I'm Sean Fox and you're watching another episode of Made to Ramble. And this time we're talking about an exciting topic, certainly near and dear to those of us with an interest in video. We're going to be comparing neutral density filters. Woohoo! Let's talk about neutral density. Let's talk about controlling shutter speed. Let's talk about all the softness and the color shift you might see. Let's talk about them. Let's talk about these. Nope. Just no. Alright, so I admit neutral density filters are not exactly the sexiest of topics, but alas, for those of us who are into videography, they are a necessary evil. You can see here my extensive collection of ND filters. I have variable ND filters as well as fixed ND filters. I have filters for pretty much every lens that I own. I also have one really decent expensive variable ND filter plus a bunch of step-up rings so that I can attach this one filter to all of my lenses. Now this would be a great all-round solution if it weren't for the fact that you have to remove the filter every time you want to stow the camera and lens in a bag, or even any time you just want to be able to put the lens cap back on. I also have a collection of filters for my GoPro Hero 4, and I've just ordered some for my newly purchased GoPro Hero 6. I even have a collection of ND filters for my drone, the DJI Mavic Pro. If it has a lens, I've got filters for it. But if I'm being truthful, I hate the bloody things. I used to own a Sony RX10, and while it wasn't necessarily an all-round solution for me, the one thing I loved about that camera was the inbuilt neutral density filters. It was fantastic having the ability to increase or decrease your ND filter at a touch of a button, rather than always having to screw these cumbersome filters to the front of your lens. I keep hoping that manufacturers might someday start to incorporate this technology into smaller mirrorless cameras, but until then, we're stuck with what we've got. So why do we use neutral density filters? There's a good chance that if you're watching this video, you probably have some idea of why we use them. But on the off chance that you're only very new to video, I'll try and take you through it. But in order to demonstrate, we're going to need to take a little drive. So shall we? Alright, that'll be good. So we're just taking a quick drive around the block over to Lake Butler, where hopefully, in order to demonstrate why we need ND filters, we're going to find something to film. Something with movement. Because at the end of the day, that's what this is all about. It's about motion. Or to be more specific, it's about motion blur. While photography and videography have lots in common, there are a few key differences. And one of the most important of these is how we use shutter. When taking a photo, there are three factors involved in setting our exposure. We have shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. You can vary all three of these to get the look that you're after and to help adapt to changing light conditions. But when you're working with video, in order to ensure that the movement looks natural to our eyes, we generally try to keep our shutter at twice the speed of our frame rate. This means that if we're filming video at 25 frames per second like I am right now, I'll favour a shutter speed of 1/50th of a second. This creates really natural, smooth looking motion blur. To use a much faster shutter speed will eliminate the motion blur almost altogether, making the video look kind of choppy and unnatural, while too slow of a shutter speed creates too much blur, which gives you footage a kind of old newsreel look about it. A pretty good example of this would be the opening scenes in Saving Private Ryan. Now, this may be the look that you're going after, and certainly there are times when I quite like using a faster shutter speed, particularly when I'm filming something with a lot of action, like I'm on a fast-moving boat or something like that. But for the most part, I'm trying to create natural-looking video, so I'll keep the shutter at twice the frame rate. Unfortunately, doing so can present a bit of a problem, especially in bright sunlight. 1/50th of a second is actually quite a slow shutter speed in terms of photography. It lets a lot of light onto the sensor. And without a filter in bright sunlight, you'd have to compensate by not only dropping the ISO, or the gain, as low as it'll go, but also by narrowing the aperture. Most of us favour a wide aperture where parts of the image are in focus while other parts, usually the background, tends to look blurry. This draws the eyes directly to the subject and helps to minimise any distraction elsewhere in the frame. Now, if the aperture is too narrow, it's not possible to achieve this look. And so this is where ND filters come in. ND filters are essentially like a pair of sunglasses that you put on the lens to limit the amount of light getting through. This enables us to keep our aperture open without having to resort to a faster shutter speed. If the ND filter is variable, meaning that we can actually change how much light gets through, we have even more control over our exposure, which is really pretty handy, especially when our lighting conditions keep changing. Like if, for example, you might be moving from bright sunlight into shade and vice versa. So that in a nutshell is why we use ND filters. Is that a clear explanation? Let me know in the comments. And now, in order to make a fair comparison between some of my many ND filters, both the cheapies and my one really good super expensive one, we should probably return back to my place, where I'll proceed to set up a little makeshift studio that we can better make our comparisons because it'll be under controlled lighting conditions. This should make it a little easier to observe any color shifts or differences in sharpness and image quality. So, how about it? Shall we get going? Alright, I've set up here behind me a pretty neutral beige backdrop. I have a very nice aperture LED daylight rated key light above and to my right, and I have on my left hand side just a basic silver reflecting umbrella on a stand without using a light there, just to help reflect a little of that light back on my left hand side, just to add a little bit of fill. There is an LED light on that stand, but it's actually pointing backwards towards the backdrop just to light the backdrop a little rather than myself. We're going to be using a number of different lenses here, so there will be some differences in sharpness and color. And in order to make a fair comparison with each of these filters, we're going to take some video first without the filter and then with the filter. And in the case of variable ND filters, what we're going to do is record some of the video at minimum ND, then somewhere in the middle of the range, and then at maximum. So let's get started. Having been sorting through all of my ND filters for this video, I've come across 3 fixed ND filters, none of which actually fit onto any of my lenses that I currently own. I'm assuming that they were probably for older cameras that I had. So this is really just going to be a comparison video on variable ND filters. Okay, this is the Sigma 18 to 35mm f1.8 at 35mm without an ND filter. Okay, well this is once again the Sigma 18 to 35mm f1.8, but this time it does have an ND filter attached. It has in fact my favorite and my most expensive variable ND filter. This is the 6-stop B&W, and this is at its minimum setting. This is the Sigma again, but this time with the B&W filter at about the halfway point. This is again the B&W filter, but this time at maximum ND. Now, of course, to compensate for the loss of light, I've had to bump the ISO all the way up to 6400, even with my lights in the room. So you will see some grain and it will affect the colors a little. All right, now this is the ever popular 12 to 35mm f2.8 version 2 by Panasonic. This is without an ND filter. looks pretty good. This is once again the Panasonic 12 to 35mm f2.8, but this time with the Aurora Power XND 2000. This is a really dark variable ND filter. I think it starts at 4 or 8 stops or something. So because the lens is only a 2.8 in this case, and the ND filter is so dark, I've had to compensate by bumping up the ISO quite a bit, but I've even had to slow the shutter down a little. Let me see if I can remember the name of this lens. I think it's the Xiaomi 25mm f0.95 Speedmaster. And this is without any ND filter. This is the Speedmaster again, but this time with the little green L variable ND filter at its minimum setting. This is the Speedmaster again, but this time with the green L ND filter set somewhere roughly in the middle of its ND range. And this is the Speedmaster again, but with the green L variable ND filter set at its maximum ND. This is being filmed with the Sony a7R II, and we're using the Sony 28mm f2.0 lens at the moment, and this is without any ND filter at all. All right, well, this is the Sony 28mm f2, but this time with the Fotga variable neutral density filter. Now you can pick these things up dirt cheap on eBay. This is the Fotga again, but this time I've bumped it up to about the halfway point in the ND range. This is the Fotga again, but this time at its absolute darkest. I've had to bump the ISO all the way up to 12,800 to make this work. Can you see the difference? Can you tell it's a cheap ND filter? So hopefully this has given you some idea of what your options are when it comes to ND filters. All ND filters introduce at least a little bit of color shift, but in general a good fixed ND filter will introduce less of a color shift than a variable ND filter. For this reason, some purists will insist upon only using fixed NDs, despite the fact that it may require continually changing your filter every time a cloud comes over or every time you move from sunlight to shade. Now, if you're involved in a major cinematic project, then this makes total sense. You aren't really running and gunning, so you have plenty of time to change filters and reset your balance between each shot. Now, if you're filming corporate videos or vlogs on YouTube, I see little point in this sort of inconvenience. Ultimately, it's all a compromise. I'm rarely concerned myself about a small color shift, so I tend to favor using variable ND filters. If I'm expecting to have the camera out at the ready all day and I'm not likely to be changing lenses a lot, I'll probably opt to use the B&W with a step-up ring. But if I think I'm going to use a number of lenses, then I'll probably stick with using the cheaper variable ND filters already mounted on each of the lenses. It's really going to depend on what I'm filming and how I'm feeling on the day. As you can see, I have options aplenty. Maybe a few too many. Okay, well, on that note, I guess that's about all for this episode. If you have any questions, feel free to ask in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you all. Hopefully you've enjoyed this video, and if so, please hit that like button. I've had a few more subscribers just in the last couple of weeks, so that's been really great to see. Thanks very much for that. And for those of you who haven't subscribed yet, please consider doing so. Next week, we'll have a bit of an interesting and kind of embarrassing music video. This one's a real oldie that I just happened across recently when I was looking over some old hard drives. I'd almost forgotten that I ever made this video, but I think you should find it a bit of a laugh, even if it is at my expense, just a bit. I'm also planning to put out a video giving my thoughts on the new GoPro Hero 6 that I recently purchased, along with a very interesting new waterproof gimbal that I'll be putting to the test at Adventure World this weekend. I'll be really interested to see how well it works, especially going down water slides. Should be a fun video. So until then, thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon.